Hello, listeners. It's Gunter here with some exciting news. We're on the lookout for sponsors to join us on our incredible journey with Inspired Change with Gunter. If your organisation cares deeply about meaningful conversations around masculinity, self development, and mental health, we'd love to partner with you. Our podcast has a wonderful, dedicated audience committed to personal growth and positive social change. By sponsoring Inspired Change with Gunter, your brand will connect with listeners who truly value thoughtful discussion and support initiatives that promote real transformation. We're incredibly proud to be ranked number 1 in Australia and number 5 in the USA on FeedSpot's top men's mental health podcasts to listen and follow in 2024. With an average of 50,000 downloads per episode each week from listeners all around the world, our reach is significant and growing. For more information on how to become a sponsor, please reach out to Miranda Spiegner Sapon, our showrunner and executive producer at miranda@noirtainment.com. We'd love to explore how we can work together to inspire change. Now, thank you for your continued support, and let's keep inspiring change together.
You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter Swoboda. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change with Gunter. I'm your host, and in this podcast I'm going to actually take you into a place that most of the time most of us don't go, and that includes psychologists, counsellors, mentors, and coaches. Now, I'm not being critical, I'm just stating a fact. And that comes from over 40 years of working with both psychologists, counsellors, and also my client population of essentially men from all sorts of different walks of life. And so you're going to ask the question, well, what's he talking about here? And what I'm talking about, as you've picked up if you've been listening to most of my other podcasts, is the importance of how we think. And that falls under the category, fundamentally, of philosophy. So this podcast, in essence, is about the philosophical process in dealing with issues of masculinity. So before you switch off and flee, I'm going to challenge you to stay with me, because I believe you're going to get some really good, juicy stuff out of this that will make you think, even if you're not a change agent per se, but rather someone who's interested in a better well-being and looking to influence others. Right? Now, again, the word influencer is something that's been bandied about in social media, and people have different reactions to it, and I'm going to be honest, my bias is always somewhat negative, because I go, well, what's that person's background? If you're 23 and you're talking about parenting and you're an influencer in the parenting space, unless you've been really good and have gathered, a degree in psychology, and possibly a, master's or PhD, I'm still going to have some questions about your position in this space, because, one thing that's going to be lacking is potentially personal experience. And I can tell you that as both a psychologist, psychotherapist, personal experience and in some instances, lived experience makes a serious difference in how I interact with my clients or with anybody about this topic. Hopefully, I'm a lot more tolerant and compassionate, but that's not necessarily sometimes the case, where I get very frustrated with the level of, I guess, rubbish that's sprouted in the digital sphere. Now, in this podcast, I'm going to sort of focus on a particular branch of philosophy. And, again, don't shut down because you might be hearing words that you're unfamiliar with. I'll explain this in detail and in easy to understand language. Okay, so from a philosophical point of view, we're talking about the difference between rhetoric and dialectic, and how these ideas can help us rethink what it means to be a man. Okay, so hang in there. So essentially, rhetoric and dialectic has its place in how we communicate. So I'm going to take you on a little time trip, in a bit like the time team, except it's not really archaeology, it's more like, the history of philosophy. And most of you have probably heard of Aristotle, very influential name in philosophy. And he was very clear about defining the language that he was using. Now, rhetoric is not just about convincing people. It's about understanding how we connect with each other. Now, back in ancient Greece, rhetoric was a big deal in public life. Whether you were in court or a political ally, and it's actually maintained its position. When we're talking, the halls of governance, the idea of rhetoric is still there. Okay. Now, Aristotle was cluey, and he knew how to make a real impact. And that was that you needed to be persuasive. And it doesn't matter whether you're a politician, a therapist, or anyone else trying to share ideas, including like in the sales process. And I often work with people who are in the sales industry, and they actually intuitively drift into it, and some of them are very good at it. So, I'll give you an example to make it simple. As a psychologist working with clients, part of my sort of shtick is to help them change harmful behaviours. Now, that's not as easy as it sounds. I mean, otherwise we would have very short-term and treatment facilities and treatment programs that would work first time out. Okay, but especially in a place like drug and alcohol, the idea is that treatment is a bit like a revolving door. People come in, get, treated, they are on the program, then they leave, and after some time, a lot of people relapse. Firstly they lapse, then relapse, and then they come back. And some people do this for years, okay? So as a therapist, I'm trying to use persuasive communication as well as other tools and techniques to help my client understand and embrace, firstly, a healthier mindset, and secondly, healthier behaviors. Now, in part, for example, in psychodynamic psychotherapy, I need to actually work out with them their understanding of the point of origin of their problem. And a lot of that stuff is in childhood trauma. Now, ironically, this applies very strongly when we talk about masculinity. So in my work with men, what I'm trying to encourage is fundamentally a shift from an ideology that is patriarchy or the traditional male sort of framework into something that's significantly more healthy. And I'm trying to encourage these guys to embrace things like vulnerability, empathy, inclusivity, equality, cooperation. And in that process, I'm trying to show men that there's much, much more to what it means to be a man than simply the stuff that we're taught from the traditional stereotype. So again, this is where I come back and try to explain that philosophy and psychology, or change, processes of change, are intertwined. They're intimately interconnected. After all, philosophy is all about loving wisdom and using it to analyze our beliefs. It gives us the tools to question traditional norms and explore new ideas, especially in areas like masculinity. Philosophy can help us create a space where we as men can express ourselves in diverse ways. We're not stuck into a box. So let me go into really breaking down what Aristotle meant by rhetoric and dialectic. Rhetoric is all about persuasion. It uses ethos, which is credibility, pathos, which is about emotion, and logos, which is about logic, to convince people, to persuade. Now, it's practical and it focuses on getting people to agree by appealing to what they already believe, in a sense. Okay, mightn't be quite that defined, but that's pretty well in a nutshell. Now, dialectic, on the other hand, is about discussion, reasoning, all in with the purpose to uncover the truth. Right? So emotion isn't so much a driving force in this. So it's more analytical and less emotional, making it great for debates and for teaching. And as a therapist, there is often a time and place where I have to use psychoeducation to educate my client about their experience. I can't give you an example. Look at how traditional masculinity and patriarchy are often seen as natural facts, when in fact they're actually social constructs reinforced by rhetoric, by the persuasiveness, by the emotionality. People use emotional appeals to maintain all sorts of ideas, especially in the sphere of masculinity. Whereas a dialectic approach involves questioning these beliefs and examining their origins and impacts. Now, I can say this about not just therapy, counseling, coaching, mentoring, but science in general, or any other sort of endeavor that we occur. I was watching a program on by these archaeologists, and it was about Chakahulyuk, which is a very interesting and meaningful archaeological project at the moment. And one of the things that one of the archaeologists was puzzling around was that in the examination of the archaeology, there were no signs that there was a hierarchy within the culture, within the society. And he seemed really bothered by this, and almost to the point where I could say he's finding it unacceptable that there is no hierarchical structure in that community. Whereas to me, I would simply go, well, let's see if there's any evidence for it or not. So far, we haven't actually seen that, right? Now, this happens in life all the time, and it's really driven by the conscious or unconscious biases. So, most of you have probably encountered the idea that when you're trying to persuade someone with reason, with dialectic, people are resistant. It's a lot easier in a way if you're a good speaker, to persuade people rhetorically. So how do we deal with that? And I run across this as a therapist all the time, where I need to really carefully work out how am I going to work with this client to help them possibly shift into a healthier state. So let me explain it this way. When people resist dialectic arguments, when they hold on tightly to their beliefs, rhetoric can actually help ease that resistance by connecting on an emotional level. It's I need to find their emotional need or the emotional block. What is it that's going on? Now, how do I do that? Well, the answer is sort of obvious, and most of us, you know, in the helping professions will go, oh, yeah, here we go again. Yes, you're right. We need to build trust. So you need to be able to build up credibility. And that comes through by being genuine, showing goodwill, and also having some sort of what we call often in philosophy gravitas. That is, you know, you can you can exhibit that you live what you speak. So to give you an example in that area, when promoting a model of masculinity that values vulnerability, sharing a personal story can help others see the strength in openness. Right? Now, self disclosure in therapy and in counseling is a bit like, a little bit's okay, too much can kill it. Right? It's like a recipe. The second bit is understanding emotion. We need to consider the person that we're talking to or the audience's emotions and their fears to connect more effectively. So, if you're in a group of men who are hesitant to express emotion, we can share stories of role models who embrace emotional openness to encourage change. And again, a little bit of self disclosure from me can often allow that process to go on. They connect to me not as this two-dimensional academic therapist, but rather to me as a human being first, then as a man, and then as a therapist. That is the essence in many respects that I see what's important. So, to be honest, in many respects, if I have unresolved issues about masculinity, whether I'm conscious of them or whether they're subconscious, that stuff will become a block. Someone or my individual client's going to pick up on the fact that I'm not congruent. And I'm very, very clear on the fact that as a therapist or as a counselor, I can only take people as far as I've explored myself. Now, a lot of people will argue this, and frankly, with 40 years seniority in the field, you're not going to persuade me otherwise. I know the difference that it makes, and that's just the way it is. Try it yourself. Think about it. Reflect on this yourself. The other part is to really be in touch with a logical foundation. Even in rhetoric, logic needs to support our arguments. We need to make sure that our arguments are sound and logical. And again, this relies on self-awareness and introspection and reflection. Right? We need to unpack our own stuff and then be able to understand it within the relationship of the other. Okay. So again, some of you might go, well, why does this really matter for therapists? Now, I've already given you some hints. But again, let me put it into a nutshell. For a therapist, mastering rhetoric and dialectic is incredibly valuable. Rhetoric helps build rapport and trust, while dialectic encourages the client to explore and question their beliefs, attitudes, values, which ultimately can lead then to personal growth. Their journey becomes expansive. So, in an example, I would, as a therapist, try to help the guy that I'm working with to express his emotions. And that might be a slow process. It's a little bit at a time. And the way that I might do that is to use rhetoric to create a safe environment, and then dialectic to help him critically examine his values, attitudes, and beliefs about being a man. And I had someone the other day come to me, and he already worked out that his emotional reaction came from him being trapped in his traditional ideas of what it is to be the provider. So let me wrap it, okay? This is a really important aspect for anyone working with men, but you can translate that into working with women, couples, and families as well. But let me keep it simple in that sense. And I've always talked about, in order for us to be good agents of change, we need to understand the philosophical underpinnings. I need to understand how I think and what I think and the connection between the two and why I think it. And that comes through careful, introspection and reflection, and a willingness to step outside or away from my preconceived ideas. We can all fool ourselves to believe in things that are just absolute, utter tripe and nonsense. Bullshit abounds in the world in buckets, not just in drops, especially at this point in our history. Most of the stuff that I see on social media is just absolutely abominably rubbish, but misleading and sometimes really persuasive. What was the latest one that I saw? Castor oil rubbed on your tummy is not going to get rid of fat, no matter how much that influencer will try to persuade you that that's actually going to work. Okay? If you want to lose fat or weight, please go to the person who can actually do that. A dietitian, your doctor, right? Now, a lot of doctors will openly admit that they're not really well trained in nutrition, and they will refer you to a dietitian and nutritionalist. Okay? So, but in order to do that, we need to understand what it is that we're doing, and that I need to put my trust into a person who's professionally trained. And in professional training, we're not just talking about training as a psychologist, a social worker, or whatever, but there needs to be an element of training in philosophical thinking. So, little segue, but let me bring it back and bring this podcast to a nicely rounded end. Fundamentally, what I'm arguing is that Aristotle's ideas on rhetoric offer valuable insights for today's conversation. Yeah, I know he's a dude who sort of died 2,000 or so years ago, but his work in many respects has credibility right here and now, especially in our conversation about masculinity. By combining philosophical thinking with the art of persuasion, we can redefine what it is to be a man in a much more inclusive and empowering way. So, let me thank you for tuning in to Inspired Change with Gunter. I hope this has given you fuel for reflection, introspection, for change. Remember that changing how we think about masculinity starts with open minds and meaningful conversations, with well-rounded conversations. So let's continue to challenge norms, to inspire change, and finally build a world where men can be their true selves without fear, without bullshit. This is me signing off. Love to hear from you. And if you're interested, please check out my work on www.guntersvoboda.com or www.goodmengreat.com.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda at noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.